Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We have a great show planned for you today. We are going to start this series called the Blue Security Maturity Model. And so this series is designed for looking at different areas of security and kind of our take on whether or not you're behind, if you're on track, or you're ahead of the curve. And this insight is kind of based on Adam and my experience talking to many customers across multiple different industries and kind of our experience, not only talking to customers, but also like in some aspects working at customers. And so we're going to give our take on where we think you are. And so we're going to start off with our favorite topic, of course, identity. So when it comes to identity, when we're looking at it, if you are kind of behind the curve, if you, for example, do not have MFA turned on, and we at Microsoft, and so just as a disclaimer, Adam and I do both work at Microsoft in our field sales, while obviously we want to stay in the good graces of our employer. The show does not reflect the official guidance or opinions of our employer. These are, Adam and my opinions. But we do have telemetry, and we've talked about this at Microsoft. We've given numbers. There are still organizations that do not have MFA deployed. And there are a lot of things that we've done within, say, Entra to kind of speed that up, like with security defaults and forcing admin portals to have MFA and so on and so forth. But believe it or not, there are still companies that do not have MFA deployed. Or if you have, say, broad MFA exceptions. I also think, and Adam, you can put your own spin on it, but if you don't have any phish-resistant MFA deployed today, you're also behind the power curve. We've talked about just how important phish-resistant MFA is, kind of moving to that next step. If you're still kind of allowing things like SMS or voice MFA, then I also think you're behind the power curve. Like those things. And I do understand there are, categories of maybe, say, frontline workers that might not have smartphones. Also, again, believe it or not, there are people today who do not have smartphones and cannot get like an app prompt. And so, those should be very limited, but like if you have broad deployment and still allow like just a regular information worker to have SMS, I think that is also kind of behind the power curve. If you're using any type of legacy authentication methods like LDAP or NTLM, like we have secure LDAP, so like they should be on secure LDAP if you're just allowing in the clear regular LDAP authentication, or if you still have, anything else that is turned on from a old school NTLM aspect, those are behind the power curve. If you're still syncing admin accounts to the cloud, so like you use your domain admin account and then you sync that to the cloud, there's guidance that Microsoft has found for probably almost 5 years now, I feel like, where we recommend that admin accounts for the cloud should be standalone and your on-prem privileged accounts should be only on-prem. And so that also requires you to kind of think about that workflow for onboarding, offboarding of disabling these accounts. But if you're still syncing like your domain account, and that is a global admin account for the cloud as well, that is not a good practice and you are behind the power curve. If you are using passwords daily for anything, you're behind the power curve. So if you're typing in a password into your computer to unlock your computer, if you're typing in a username password to access any type of enterprise application, you're behind the power curve. So we'll talk about like where you should be for on track. But if you're using a password at all, you are behind the power curve. If you're still provisioning user accounts as service accounts, I think this is one of the tougher ones, but if you're still using user accounts for service accounts for different purposes, I believe that you are behind the power curve. Like you should be using, if it's on-prem, moving to a GSMA, the general managed service accounts, or service principals, basically non-loggable machine type accounts rather than accounts that can be used with a username and password that is specifically for a service account. So I think a lot of companies are still doing that, but there needs to be a plan to move off of those. And then finally, if you are providing contractors or CSPs, cloud service providers, or MSPs, managed service providers with standing access. So there should be some sort of governance because these are accounts that aren't part of your organization, but you've granted them access into your organization. I think that you should have a better process for that. And I think oftentimes contractors are not thought of as part of the regular onboarding. Like they don't go through the same HR process, but they should. And if you're granting them access into your environment with credentials, there are better ways to do that. And Adam, you have some thoughts here. I'll let you riff on some stuff here.
Yeah, I added one more too while you were talking. If you're not using single sign-on or you're creating separate accounts for SaaS applications, also behind the curve. Your users should not have a separate Salesforce.com account. They should not have a separate Box.com account. They should not have a separate Slack login if you're an enterprise. So by the way, just to kind of level set too on this would be for any organization that I would classify as an enterprise, and we'll use a rough definition of, say, 1,500 information workers on up. Scaling, for the most part, Andy, you and I have not supported like 100,000 seat customers. So, maybe it doesn't quite apply to you. Your curve would look slightly different if you're either a small business that has 500 employees, or if you are a 100,000 seat, multinational. I expect you to be even more mature than this. So this is kind of to set that target. Let's say anywhere from 1,500 to 20,000 seats is more kind of our target, I think, for this maturity model. But yeah, just to riff on what you shared, and for the most part, you unpacked most of this, but just to highlight a couple of them. And you said, if you haven't started your phish-resistant MFA deployment, absolutely behind. You don't have to have it deployed for everyone, but if you haven't even dipped your toe in the water and had your like global admin set up phish-resistant MFA, you're behind. You need to do that. You need to do that yesterday. Do not like seeing MFA exceptions. At this point, every sign-in should do MFA every time. If you're getting prompted too much, you're also doing it wrong. There are ways to configure MFA for every single sign-on, but keeping sign-ons active. And by the way, as long as we're talking about this, it is not a sign of maturity to require users to constantly re-authenticate. That is not mature. In fact, that's a really outdated approach because it trains your users to respond like the lab rat hitting the button to get the food pellet, as opposed to thinking very conscientiously about when and how they're providing their credentials. More authentications does not equal more security. Syncing admin accounts to the cloud. This is guidance that has changed, but changed many years ago now. The reason we don't like to see that is because it allows lateral movement from, if I compromise on-premises identity providers, I can then move to the cloud and have high level of privilege without doing any more work. We saw this a lot during COVID, and now I'm going to blank on which attack it was. Was that SolarWinds where we saw a lot of it?
Yes.
Yeah. They were right when we started the show, actually. Attackers were able to compromise on-premises identity infrastructure like Duo, and then use that to mint their own tokens and then move laterally to the cloud where they had global admin. It's like, at least make that harder on the attackers. Don't let just because you got admin privilege here and you got privilege escalation over here, mean you get it over there too. Make them do the work twice at a minimum and improve that model as well. And the only other one I'll call out here, and we can move on. If you are typing a password daily, you're doing it wrong at this point. Like, I'm not saying passwords should be entirely gone. Passwords shouldn't exist. We're not even technically to that point in Microsoft, although in theory we are. I haven't typed my Microsoft password in years, but it still exists somewhere. It's still stored in my user object in Active Directory domain services, even though I don't use it anymore. But if you're hitting Control-Delete and typing a password, gross. Like, we need to get that fixed ASAP. That's another thing we got to jump on and start moving away from as well. So I think these are good highlights of what behind looks like. If you heard a couple of these, great. it's time to make plans to remediate those. But for the most part, hopefully most of our listeners and viewers are going, yeah, we don't do that anymore. Yeah, we don't do that anymore. And maybe the only other one I'll call out as well, reducing your reliance on the old phone system, on voice calls and SMS. Microsoft has gotten really strong with very strongly recommending you move away from those. Ideally, you wouldn't even have those provisioned as recovery methods. We don't. We don't allow them at Microsoft. You cannot get a text message. You cannot get a voice call to identify your account anymore. Those are not allowed, but you could allow them only in particular use cases, like you mentioned, Andy, scenarios where maybe you don't want to provide an alternative method of signing in. You don't want to issue, say, a YubiKey to the user instead or whatever, or maybe for frontline workers. But in general, you should not have broad SMS or voice call enabled as methods for most of your users today. It's just, and the reason why is it takes it out of your hands. It makes you reliant on AT&T or T-Mobile, and there are tens of thousands of employees who will hold the line on security and not get social engineered into turning over access to a SIM card swap and letting them swap the SIM of your CEO and then compromising their account. It takes it out of your hands and puts it in the hands of someone else that you have no control over. That's the problem with relying on phone transportation methods for authentication. It's just too far outside your control. You want to bring that in-house and control methods you can manage and monitor.
Okay, so let's talk about where we think you are if you're on track. So if you're requiring MFA for every single login, every single time, as well as requiring maybe some sort of additional factor like device trust, a compliant device, then you're on track. And when I say broad exceptions, like in requiring MFA every time, it's like if you say you don't require MFA because I'm egressing from the company IP, like that's bad, right?
Do not do that.
But if I say require MFA and on top of that, you also have to come from an IP that is part of the network, that's
good.
Adding an additional condition. And so, that should be where you're at. Like you're not exempting MFA, you are requiring MFA every single time, as well as maybe additional factors like device trust or network.
Yeah, I want to plus one that. At this point, I think MFA for every single sign-in is maybe even a little behind the curve. That additional factor, I think, is on track today, where I don't care what that additional factor is, but one thing above and beyond, you provided your password, you did a second factor, you tapped a notification from your authenticator app. I want one more thing today. And I think that's on track, whether that's, to Andy's point, egressing from the right network, coming from a trusted network device, at least synthesizing some sort of trust signal or sign-in risk or user risk signal, at least one of those additional factors, ideally multiple of them, but at least one.
Phish-resistant MFA, we talked about if you don't have any. Like if you are on track, I would say you have phish-resistant MFA provisioned for your privileged accounts. That's, I think, table stakes today. So, we talked about where you are behind. So this is where you are if you're on track. You have phish-resistant MFA for privileged accounts. If you've deployed other passwordless methods like Windows Hello for Business, this reduces the number of times that users have to enter in their passwords. If you have long password expirations, so we've talked about password expirations and why they're bad, but like at the very minimum, have like a long password expiration, like 1 year. Ideally, you don't have it at all, and that's where we'll be when we get to the ahead of the curve. But having something really long, 1 year, 2 years, where your users are not having to constantly change it. I know that some organizations have like 60 days or 90 days or 6 months. I think that's a very bad practice. We don't have to dive into why, but have something long. Password protection. So this is specifically to like a Entra, feature, but there might be other vendors that have this type of similar capability. But when I say password protection, I don't mean password complexity. Like if you're looking at like GPOs and I must have one capital letter, one lowercase letter, it's got to be this long. I'm talking about like if I put in the word password as a password, even with the complexity, right? Capital P, an @ symbol, dollar sign, right?
Yeah.
Like, so even if I put in that, in some sort of like, leet speak, it'll still flag it. And so like password protection, this is an Entra feature. Like it checks a dark web list of commonly known passwords, breached passwords, as well as you can create your own custom list. Like I live in Wisconsin, so the word Packers, Brewers, Badgers, they get used quite a bit, or the name of your company, right? That's often used as well. So make sure that you have that deployed or something similar to it. Self-service password management, right? Like how much your help desk is having to reset passwords. Like this should be, if you are still having your help desk reset passwords, then you probably are behind the curve. If you have self-service password management enabled, you're on track. You should be deprecating those SMS and voice message MFA methods. You should be deprecating legacy auth like LDAP and NTLM. You should be using modern auth. Adam talked about SSO. So you should have SSO for your SaaS apps and for your desktop. You're using federation for those B2B collaboration versus like granting standing access. You should reduce the number of role assignments that are privileged. And you should start using just-in-time or PIM, privileged identity management, for privileged roles and scope access to what is needed. So Azure and Entra will flag you if you have more than 5 global admins. Global admin should be a very limited role that you grant out. And so, some organizations, they have like 20 global admins. It's actually kind of crazy. So look at your cloud admins, look at your domain admins, see what is exactly needed. Because if people don't actually need it on a daily basis or use it for administrative work, then it should be taken away. Break your sync for your cloud admins. We talked about that. Make sure, and that if you've already done that and you have a good plan for it, you are on track. Emergency access accounts. There's a whole Entra documentation on break glass accounts. You should have break glass accounts provisioned, and they should be, these are the ones that actually need MFA exception, or you use a phish resistant physical key that's stored in like a vault. That's probably the better way to do it, is have MFA enabled, but have a physical key that's stored in a vault that you document when it's checked out and when it's used, and have a robust alerting around when that account is logged in. But you got to have a break glass account if your admins get locked out. Using B2B Lighthouse with privileged identity management for your CSPs and MSPs, right? So having them log into your environment with guest accounts. Actually, I was talking with this is really interesting. If you don't know, when you use B2B, the guest accounts get created in your environment, and they are then beholden to your conditional access policies. So you can scope conditional access policies for those guest accounts. They're bringing their own identity, but they use your identity policies. There's another method where you can have a B2B trust within Entra, where you're actually doing a tenant to tenant trust. When you do that, you are beholden to the other organization's identity policies. So they don't require MFA. They're not going to MFA when they come into your environment, because they're logging into their identity using their identity policies. So be very careful when you're doing that tenant to tenant trust, because it is a trust. They are bringing their own identity and their own identity policies, versus if it was a B2B, like with a guest account, you can scope conditional access policies for those guest users. And that's maybe a small distinction, but a very, very important one. And then finally, this is something that a lot of organizations don't have a good control over, is that the Azure Enterprise Agreement Portal, it doesn't integrate with Azure RBAC or conditional access. So when you sign into the Enterprise Agreement Portals, that's where you can provision Azure subscriptions. And there's a dedicated administration account that is targeted for policy and monitoring on that. And so usually that is with billing or your financial organization, because they're the ones who work with Microsoft to get the EA and everything stood up. Same thing with the MCA roles, which is kind of the newer model for purchasing. They don't integrate with PIM. And so you have dedicated MCA accounts or EA portal accounts. And these are really important because they're the ones that can provision new subscriptions. And so even if you're a global admin, subscription roles are different, right? Like owner of subscription, contributor of subscription, and the people who provision it from the financial portion of it, the MCA or the EA, they can dictate who is an owner of that subscription. They will be able to see every single subscription because it has financial implications, but they may not designate everyone as an owner. So even if you're global admin, you might not be able to see or have permissions over different subscriptions that are in your environment, which of course affects security. So you need to find out who they are, how they have access, and monitor those accounts because it has obviously some financial implications for your company.
Starting with the last thing first, just as an awareness, the enterprise agreement as it relates to Azure specifically is going away. All customers are being migrated from enterprise agreement based billing to Microsoft customer agreement based billing over time. So as like you have a renewal come up, ideally and most likely your commercial executive will migrate you to the Microsoft customer agreement, and there's some benefits to doing that. So I would anticipate over time those rules may integrate with PIM. I was going to add a yet to that as you were talking through it, Andy, because I'm sure that's on the roadmap and that's on the plan to do. So some of the limitations there with like the EA agreement portal not integrating with Azure RBAC or conditional access, that eventually will go away and won't be a ongoing concern as people's enterprise agreements expire. So something to know there. Great call out on all of that. As far as everything else you shared, I don't think I have a ton of color to add, but I do just want to highlight a couple of things. Just in general with password management, our employer put out a document before I was hired. So it goes all the way back to 2016, where they recommended stop expiring passwords, stop having complexity requirements, stop doing all these things. And then those were adopted and baked into some of the government recommendations, some of the, was it FIPS,
This.
Andy? NIST, thank you. Yeah, NIST 800, I think, like a year or two later. So the long story short is neither of these are new things. Neither of this is new guidance. This is tried and true, 9 and 7 years respectively between Microsoft and NIST saying to stop do these things. I understand you may have some regulatory burden that's still preventing this. And if you do, obviously create an exception for you. But otherwise, if you don't have regulatory requirements and it's someone just digging their heels in, it's time to have that fight. It's time to have that conversation. To be on track today, you should not have password complexity requirements. Your password should have at minimum long expirations, and you should be actively minimizing the use of passwords in your environment. Your users should find it unusual when they're asked to put in their password. That is a modern on-track enterprise today, where if I get asked for my password, I get taken aback a little bit. I go, whoa, that's unusual. Let me think about this before I do that. May not be gone, may not be 0 times, but it should be limited in appearance today. So that would be kind of my hill to die on here. Otherwise, we talked about MFA. I already kind of chimed in and said I want to see at least one additional factor. Absolutely, you should have phish-resistant MFA deployed and required for all privileged roles. That is on track today. If you're not doing that, you are, in my humble opinion, and Andy's, a little behind. Single sign-on, as much as possible, all sanctioned SaaS apps in your organization should flow through your single sign-on provider. I understand there may be exceptions. There may be applications that say the marketing team uses or the social media team uses that don't support SSO, don't support SAML. Obviously, exceptions for those, create other ways to manage and control those as much as you can. When they're exceptions, they're easier to manage than when it's a free-for-all and every SaaS app has its own identity, has its own accounts, has its own everything. You should have to be really buttoned up and mature on how you do identity management for third-party applications, and you should have standardized on a single identity provider. That is absolutely on track. Otherwise, I think pretty good stuff here, and I think we can move on to what ahead looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to just I hate this corporate term, but double click on what you said, apps that don't support like federation. Social media is one that does come to mind that you mentioned. And so like using like an enterprise solution like a Sprout, or there's multiple ones where you can like federate that app, which then posts have to go through that application in order to then be access to the social media accounts, where you're not logging in natively to the account. Understand obviously that like there does have to be credentials created, and so you have to still have native credentials created for that application, for that account. But then managing the users who then do the normal posting through the enterprise applications that's federated with their enterprise account. So something like that, where you're decreasing the amount that having to use that native credential.
That is a huge risk too. It's maybe not cybersecurity risk, but it's reputational damage, which we also concern ourselves with in cybersecurity. Huge reputational damage risk. You need to be really buttoned up on how you manage access to social media. That should be pretty locked down because that is the public face of your company. And I am painting with a little bit of a broad brush here, but tends to be people who are a little bit earlier in career, maybe not as well versed with like business professionalism in some cases. And that's good. Like we love sometimes our corporate accounts to have a little irreverence to their tone and style. I'm like the McDonald's Twitter account does a great job at this of being a little kind of off the rails. And even I think our employer, some of the accounts are actually pretty funny. Like the Windows Twitter account is actually really funny and humorous. And you need that irreverence to it. It's interesting. But at the same time, you need to be really buttoned up on when and how stuff gets posted because it's so powerful. So great call out there.
All right. Ending with ahead of the curve. So you are ahead of the curve if a password is never used. And Adam mentioned that our employer at Microsoft, we never use our passwords. I set it the first day that I got hired. And the only time, interesting enough, I talked about that B2B connection. The only time I've used my password is when my Microsoft account has been invited to another organization where I was a guest user in their organization and they required password plus MFA. They had not enabled passwordless authentication or push notifications for their accounts. And so I was, again, beholden to their identity policies. So it would pop up in anytime I accessed that Teams and my guest account using my Microsoft.com account in their environment, and it would ask me for a password. And I'm like, it was a red flag for me. The first time it happened, I was like, what is this? I don't even know my password. So you are ahead of the curve if a password is never used in daily operations.
And it was a slow burn to get there. I mean, so this is something where you got to start somewhere. I mean, again, I'm 8.5 years of Microsoft now. And when I started still in 2017, I still did my password I don't know, once a month. I still got prompted for it sometimes. There were some areas. And then that just slowly shrunk with time. And today I would say I never use my password. Today it is never. But it took a while to get there. It took a long time. And the technology is getting easier to be there. But I do feel confident in using that word now. I never use my password. And that is a interesting level of maturity.
Another one would be the passwords never expire. And so not only are you not using them, but you set it with a really long, complex password, and then it never expires. So like Adam said, we don't really have the technology yet to not have a password exist, but existing passwords should not expire. And I understand, of course, there are some regulatory compliance that still are dated and require you to do it. But, as long as possible. And then, of course, like never expire is the goal.
Well, and so consumer Microsoft accounts do allow you to not have a password. So I have a Surface laptop over here that's provisioned with my consumer account. And because I signed into it with my consumer Microsoft account that doesn't have a password, that device does not even allow password as an option to sign in. When I go to the Windows sign-in screen, I can do PIN or I can do face. That's it. There is no other option. There is no password option. We do plan to bring that to Entra ID in the future. We have said so publicly many times. It's honestly just been a little more work than we expected. But the plans are coming to where you can have an Entra ID user object that does not have a password at all. And there's a lot of crossover between like consumer Microsoft accounts. We take learnings from that and then bring them to the corporate account, to the Entra ID. So it is coming. We have built that technology. It does exist, just not in the enterprise space yet.
Requiring multiple factors for every login. Adam, you kind of put this into the previous one, but I think
I said one.
At least one. Yeah.
This time I want many.
Many multiple factors for every login. So that means I'm looking at the device compliance, whether or not it is up to date, has up to date AV, has the right operating system. Are they on the right network, egressing from the right IP? Is the sign-in risk and the user risk low? Or, and so looking at multiple conditions for every single login before they can get access to corporate resources.
Again, and we're not holding up Microsoft as the one and only way to do it, but this is how Microsoft functions today. To successfully sign into any Microsoft service, my device must be managed in Intune. It must be compliant with all the Intune policies. I must be coming from Entra Global Secure Access. I must be using that Global Secure Access agent, kind of our Zscaler compete. And my user risk and sign-in risk both must be low in order to complete a successful sign-in. So I am checking 4 factors above and beyond phish resistant MFA just to access the Microsoft environment. So there is a very high level of confidence this is a valid login that's allowed to proceed. I'm not just going off of, oh, your username and password are right, or your username and password are right, and I sent you a text message. Like, it's way beyond that at that point. And that's where, to get ahead of the curve, you've got to be using those multiple sign-in factors.
When it comes to privileged identities, everything is just-in-time access. So using some sort of just-in-time access and monitored and logged. Privileged identity management in Entra is kind of the Entra way to do it, but there are other identity providers that have this type of capability. So you do for sure do not have standing access to global admin. That should not happen. You should always have to PIM to global admin. Now, understandably, other admins you might say, okay, I'm going to, because it's used so much, but I would argue, like, even if it's used daily, you should have to PIM to it. You get 8 hours or whatever, your shift, and then it goes away. So PIMing, like other really, really important ones, like Exchange Administrator, that's like the second most powerful privileged role in Entra. Definitely should PIM to that. Data security. So like your compliance administrator should also be one that you have to PIM to. So those are ones that I think in ideal world, you would PIM to everything. Maybe you can provide some exceptions to this, but I think you're ahead of the curve if you're PIMing to every single privileged role. Shifting from user service accounts to Azure, Service Principal or GMSAs, that is something that does take a while. But what you can, we often talk about going back and like cleaning up stuff and then having like a new direction. So like maybe you just make the policy that today, going forward, anything new will be a GMSA or a service principal. We're not going to provision user accounts anymore. And then going back and kind of cleaning up and like migrating old user accounts that are service, quote unquote service accounts, or having something else like looking at those accounts and making sure that they're only able to access this particular VM or this particular service, maybe not migrating them, but at least cleaning it up so that it's scoped. These service accounts are for a particular service, so we're not going to allow them to log in, have a GPO and target that user account to not be able to interactively log into a machine. And so, going back and cleaning up. So like shifting those service accounts, I think both cleaning up and scoping if you can't migrate to GMSAs or service principals, and then having the attitude and the strategy of saying going forward, this is the direction that we're going in for service accounts.
Burned end migration, always the best way to go in most cases. And by the way, we almost made it through a whole show without saying AI, but agentic AI obviously on the horizon, and managing agent identities equally as important. I know our employer, Andy, has got some interesting stuff coming with Agent 365 and Agent ID. You don't need to have that fully deployed to be ahead of the curve today. I mean, if you're even looking at that, you're ahead of the curve. But stay on top of that, right? To continue to stay ahead of the curve and make sure you're being really conscientious about how you manage agent IDs as well.
Having a very strong governance program. This is something that I think a lot of organizations struggle with. And if you have a very good governance program, you are probably more in the ahead of the curve category. So you're performing access reviews on sensitive resources and sensitive roles, making sure that, if Adam has access today, if he changes roles, should his access be revoked, as I review it 3 months later or whatever. Having entitlement management enabled. Entitlement management is great because, again, this is an Entra type feature, but allowing self-service access to different packages and having that log. So if I want access to a specific SharePoint site or access to a M365 group that grants access to sensitive data in a SharePoint site or a Teams or a role, right? Having that logged and reviewed, and then allowing users to do it if it's approved already. And then finally, authentication context. This is that condition after the authentication, right? So this is a session type control. After authentication, if I want to, I've already authenticated using all the things, but now I'm accessing a top secret SharePoint site with really sensitive data. I'm going to then prompt for something else. So maybe you have MFA deployed for users, but then I'm going to check for a phish resistant MFA when I'm accessing post authentication for this SharePoint site, or maybe global admin, right? Like I'm going to PIM to Exchange admin and I will require phish resistant MFA. But if I'm going to PIM to global admin, I'm going to require that you be coming from a specific machine or a specific IP address, as well as phish resistant MFA and compliant device. So it's post authentication designed for things that are really, really sensitive, or it could be other things too. Like you could require a user agreement, right? Like for a specific thing. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be like sensitivity related. It could be a business process as well. So it's just something that happens after authentication that's within the session that you can then prompt for additional context. And so I think that's more advanced. If you have that going, you are ahead of the curve.
Yeah, that last one first. I touched on in one of the previous sections, I think it was behind the curve. I said, if you're requiring users to re-authenticate too much, that's immature. However, I meant in general. In specific circumstances, asking for re-authentication is good, and you should do that. For example, one thing Microsoft does, again, I'm not holding this up as saying we do everything right, but I do appreciate this. To access our benefits site requires a re-authentication. I think that's smart because that's where I could do things like, I don't know, change my direct deposit, redirect it to another bank account. Just because my PC is unlocked and someone happened to walk up to it doesn't mean I want them to be able to just go click on benefits and turn off my 401k or go redirect my paycheck. There should be just a prompt to re-authenticate. And it could even be the same authentication, but just making me revalidate my face or re-plug in my PIN for Windows Hello. Still a useful tool. And so this can be those sorts of things. Andy, and you maybe hinted at something that we'll get on in our maturity model for device management, things like privileged access workstations or secure access workstations, PAW-SAW, you could require for you to become a global admin that you must be coming from a privileged access workstation. And we'll get into that more when we do that show. But these are the kind of things you should be conscientious of and doing to be that really ahead of the curve model. And I do think a lot of customers are doing some sort of annual, quarterly revalidation for some roles. Ahead of the curve is if you're doing it for all privileged roles, all sensitive roles of any kind, not just global admins, but even the person in your legal team, your paralegal who has access to e-discovery. They should be doing quarterly revalidation as well. Do you still need this privilege? Because to be able to search all of the content in your enterprise is super powerful and risky. And you need to make sure that that power is being wielded correctly, just like the global admin role. So all privileged roles should be revalidated. And then one thing we didn't touch on a whole lot, but I'll just briefly plug, ahead of the curve organizations are really buttoned up on entitlement management. Nothing happens manually. There is no manual assignment. I don't go manually assign anyone to any group. I have an entitlement package in my identity governance solution, whatever I'm using, that I deploy instead. And so I take the time to deploy those entitlement management packages to create them, and then I use them. There is no one-off practice because that protects me that when I have a role change or when it's no longer needed, everything can happen automated at machine speed and scale, as opposed to having someone to remember or go find the note that we added the CIO to this group because they asked us to this one day, creating this exception, and now nobody knows about it. So being really buttoned up on like your identity governance, your entitlement management is another ahead of the curve thing, where if you use it for everything consistently, really, really powerful. So I think we've got some great examples here of what ahead of the curve organizations look like. They don't use passwords. Users never plug in their passwords. They do phish resistant MFA all of the time. They're requiring additional factors for every single sign-in above and beyond that phish resistant MFA. No one has standing access. We are revalidating access all of the time. We're using entitlement management packages to deploy additional access or features or capabilities. And we're being thoughtful about when and how we ask users to either re-authenticate or do step-up authentication to access even more sensitive content and resources.
All right. Well, that was a great show. That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. I will toss one of the links into the show notes, which is just Entra Best Practices if you want to review that. And yeah, our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.